views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Coming up on this edition of Special People, Special Issues, the history of the agency, employment, and a whole lot more. We're starting right now. SPSI starts right now. Stay tuned. Welcome to this edition of Special People, Special Issues, the one and only program that for the past 18 years has been focusing on the needs, concerns, and achievements of the differently able. I'm your host, Lawrence Seiler. On this edition, we talk about the history of an organization called Lifespire, the history of an agency, and employment. We would like to welcome Lifespire, Mark Van Voorst,
hello,
CEO, and Diane Vager, and the rest of Lifespire. Welcome to Special People, Special Issues.
Thank
you guys for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, what are the missions and goals of Lifespire?
Quite done.
Well, the mission of Lifespire is to integrate special needs adults and children into every aspect of society, be it home, education, employment, recreation.
Okay. Since we're talking about employment today and history of the agency, can you tell me a little bit about, well, knowing that we have a book here, and this is a vast history of the Lifespire agency, can you tell me how the agency came about, and then we go from there?
Well, I'll let Mark do that. He's the CEO for the company, so he can speak about where our founding days came from.
Sure.
Thanks,
the organization began decades ago when a woman who was from the Bronx, Ida Rappaport, had a son with a developmental disability who was in school. And in those days, the schools had the right to ask students to leave. I believe it was at 14. And she had a problem with that. And so she got together with several of her neighbors and over time put together a coalition that became very effective in terms of advocating for the rights of these individuals to go to school. Eventually there was legislation passed in New York State that allowed individuals with disabilities to stay in school until they were 21. And so that was basically the founding part of the organization. Then it morphed into sheltered workshops and this sort of stuff. But in the mid-'70s, there was the Willowbrook debacle, where people discovered really what was going on in these developmental centers, and that became probably a key point where the industry that we're in basically took off. There was a court order that basically said the institutions needed to be deinstitutionalized, and that became the growth of the placement of these individuals in your regular community. Since that time, the organization has grown tremendously. I actually came on in 2001, at which point the agency had roughly revenues of $56 million. It ran residences, it ran large day programs, it ran an array of programs. Since that time, we've actually grown to almost double that size. And again, we provide an array. And the interesting thing about it is if you say the word, somebody with a developmental disability, that seems to bring up a picture. But there is no single person that you can characterize as developmentally disabled. It's a spectrum. So we serve folks who, if you saw on the street, you would probably not even recognize as having a developmental disability, to individuals who are so profoundly disabled that they need round-the-clock, minute-by-minute care. On the non-residential side, we have day programs that offer everything from a traditional classroom sort of setting, the traditional workshops, which are now dying, and then the new push, and what some of these folks can talk about, is this push to get people into regular employment where they are making no less than minimum wage, and we've been somewhat successful in that. At this stage, we have close to, I think, 240, 250 individuals that we work with that actually have jobs in the community where they are making no less than minimum wage.
Ranging what type of jobs?
Oh gosh, they're in stores like Walgreens. We've worked in colleges and food service areas. We've worked on a golf course.
Small boutiques like the Blue Tree up on the Upper East Side or Carnegie Hill. We have individuals that work there. We have individuals that work in mailrooms for brokerage houses.
Landscaping crews. We've got somebody who works in a police department. So
as a administrative file clerk, something like that?
I think she's more or less like a file clerk, but maybe a little higher than a file clerk. She's been there for a long time. We also do a lot of volunteerism, and the new vogue is to look at things like internships. So you have the opportunity to match up an employer with an individual to see if there's a good match, and hopefully an internship will evolve into a job. Because our goal, too, is to try to get these folks out into jobs where they can make a living wage. And that's going to be the mantra that the whole industry is going to be hearing over the next decade. That, shelter workshops are
when we excuse me. Now, when we mention workshops in the history of employment, employment has changed. Can you kind of go through what a workshop is? Not necessarily a class, because people might think it is. But can you go through that?
You know, workshops were sort of developed as a set-aside place where individuals with developmental disabilities could do work and could get paid. The federal law allowed you to get an operating certificate that permitted you to pay below minimum wage. How did that work? Well, basically, they would take a product and break it down into the steps, and they would say, okay, an individual who was not disabled could make 100 of these in an hour, and that became the floor for the minimum wage. If somebody that was in our program was at 50% of that, they made 50% of minimum wage. So you could see people walking home with a paycheck that was maybe just a few dollars, all the way up to,
depending on how slow or fast they were.
Correct. Now, is
that fair?
It depends on how you define fair, because you could look at it this way too. If you commingled individuals with disabilities with individuals who were not, and you could produce 100, and for that 100 you made minimum wage, and I could only produce 2, one could make an argument that that's not fair, because you're obviously producing at a higher rate than I am, and therefore you should be making more money. On the other hand, it has fallen out of vogue. What concerns us is how to replace that, though, because over the past 20 years, manufacturing has basically left the country. There are service jobs. Now, we do have some contracts with government agencies where we're making a product, but I think more and more you're going to see these things being closed down, and you're going to have to find work in the existing community for these people, which is hugely challenging. I mean, it's very difficult to go in and persuade an employer that it's in his or her interest to hire somebody who has a developmental disability who may not be able to produce at a level that 20 other people who are standing in line have. But that's going to be the challenge over the next decade.
Okay. A little while before we get to break, can you really explain what you guys do for the agency of Lifespire?
Well, we do in general. Well, we provide different types of supports for people who have different levels of independence. So we have residences, we also have day services, we have an Article 16, we provide MSC, so we have somebody who's coordinating the services for the people that we support. And we are vast, and we serve over 5,000 individuals, and we are in the 5 boroughs, and now currently we're actually moving upstate to New York. Yeah.
No, since Lifespire has been around, before that, the history of people or agencies with special needs was almost nil, correct?
True. The history is actually kind of interesting, because it morphed from churches basically taking over these sorts of people to then it morphed into institutions. And as bad as Willowbrook was, 20 years before Willowbrook had a bad name, there were lots of people who thought that institutionalization was the place to go. Willowbrook obviously demonstrated that it wasn't great, and over the past many decades, we have successfully shown that people can be integrated into society just like everybody else. But don't kid yourself, Larry, that there's been a tremendous change on the part of the outside world. It is still a challenge to find residences, to place folks there. The neighbors, can still be very resistant. Finding jobs is difficult. So we're getting there, but it's a struggle.
Excuse me while we go to break. More on the history of Lifespire and employment for people with special needs when we return in a moment. Stay tuned.
Enroll, we say, we want you to be okay. Enroll, we say, take care of people for goodness sake. There's a plan for every budget, so don't accept defeat. Now you can get covered and still buy me treats.
You take care of your pets. Now it's their turn to take care of you. Visit getcoveredamerica.org to learn about your health insurance options.
So they say it's a man's world? Well, I don't see anybody's name on it. While they were out doing their thing, we slowly changed all that. We changed all that. Today, women can do anything men can do. And there's one thing we're even better at.
Separate raw meats from other foods by using different cutting boards. 3,000 Americans will die from food poisoning this year. Keep your family safer. Check your steps at foodsafety.gov.
Welcome back to Special People, Special Issues. Now let's continue about the history of the agency and more on employment with Lifespire. Welcome back to Special People, Special Issues.
Thank you, Larry.
Let's talk about why it's so important to have adequate staff, but more importantly, why people don't want to really work with our population, and some of the history and some of the story about that.
Well, I think Diana can answer some of that because she's responsible for bringing in the recruits, and Tom can talk to you then about some of the problems that we end up with some of the staff that we've had.
Okay.
So in terms of, your first part of the question was, what was that again?
Why is it so hard to find adequate staff to work with our population or people with special needs?
Sometimes it's lack of training and lack of understanding of what it means to work with someone to provide that support, which is very different than being very custodial, doing things for. And so to find somebody who's qualified means that they have to not only meet the requirements of someone who can coach and support somebody, but they also have to meet a lot of regulatory requirements. So there are a lot of rules and regulations, and there are also some things that they have to, in terms of the Justice Center, we have some other, they have to take all kinds of testing that there has to be done in order for them to qualify. And unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of experience out there. And so very often people who are new to the field who think, oh, this is easy to work with people, decide to come in, and then we find out there's a lot more training that they need to take.
I hate saying horror stories, but there has been some, we don't want to say horror stories because, working with people with special needs is a rewarding experience. But can you explain some, besides Willowbrook and Letchworth Village, which was another one, can you explain some of the horror stories of why it's important for background checks and all that kind of stuff?
That's a fairly easy one. We work with a very vulnerable population. People with special needs need advocacy. And if they're unable to advocate for themselves, they need every staff person who works with them, be it in a workshop, be it in a group home, be it in a school, a place of employment. They need someone to advocate for them, possibly, or support them to exercise their rights appropriately and not to be a victim of abuse. The difficult thing with finding staff or finding qualified staff, because the system over the years, when I first came into the field, and Mark I won't say for Diana because she's only 10 years old.
There you go. Thank you.
But the difficult thing was that you required a college degree, and you were either an educator or a psychologist or a vocational rehab person. You had a specialty, and there was the rise of advocacy, the Vietnam War and women's rights, the right to vote. It just went along and it flowed. That there was a reason to sit there and have a voice and give people a voice. There still is that reason. But I think society over time has almost kind of squelched our cries to say that we need to be supported in the right way. Because the disabled population is very easy, because they don't have a loud voice, is very easy to take away money and services from them and saying, well, we balance out the budget. We have to remember that we deal with people, and people are very complicated. You're not a widget, I'm not a widget.
And you know how many times the President of the United States doesn't mention people with special needs in his address. So when we're put to the side, it's not such a very good thing.
Well, I think what society forgets is that at some point in life, every person's going to need help. One day someone's going to have to help me put on my diaper. I'll be in a nursing home, most likely. But I definitely want to be treated with dignity and respect. And I want to, and the best way to do that is to train people now that work in the field to have that mindset and that philosophy to treat people with dignity and respect.
I also think that it's very different. We get a lot of people who I think that the job is babysitting. So if I bring them into the room and I turn on the TV, and if nothing bad happens, it was a good day. And that's not what we do. What we do is we find out what needs to get done, and we push people to accomplish certain things, which in turn may create some resistance on your part. One of the things we tell all the newly trained staff is that even though you're working with a group of people who have developmental disabilities, if you think that that means you can shut off your mind, you're making a huge mistake, because you've got to be 2, 3, 4 steps ahead of that person. You've got to see what the problem is. How can I break this down into further steps? That's where Tom is an absolute star in, is that he could break down a job that you and I look at as, oh, it's 2 steps, and he'll break it down into 10, 12, 15 steps, because that's how the learning process is. And we have forgotten that that's exactly how we learned. All of us took algebra.
Well, we hardly use it.
And we don't even remember it anymore. That is the same principle that has to be applied to the folks that we're working with. We break these things down into very small steps until the skill is acquired, and then we try to maintain it.
Also, Larry, the salaries are very low.
Okay.
And with very low salaries, it's very difficult to attract the staff with the talent that we need and the skill.
Another thing, you can write a book, have a class, and there are classes on direct care work and all that stuff.
Sure.
But it's learning by doing that's important. The book can go out the window, but if you don't learn, and then techniques change. What you learned in 1970 is not what you learn now.
Right. And in the way people learn it. That's why the DSP core competencies, which is a word that we're using a lot now, it really, it makes a relationship between the DSP and staff person and supervisors and their entire clinical team, so that they're getting that hands-on support continuously throughout their shifts.
Well, I would like to thank you for joining me on this edition of Special People Special Issues. When we come back, we'll have the Special People Special Issues bulletin board. More when we return in a moment. Stay tuned.
Cook foods to the right temperature using a food thermometer. 3,000 Americans will die from food poisoning this year. Keep your family safer. Check your steps at foodsafety.gov.
You're doing great. We're going to try this again, okay?
Okay.
Wheels, pedals, handlebar, brakes. Sit up straight, keep your weight in the center, keep your eyes on the road, hands on the grips, butt in the seat. If we feel ourselves falling, what do?
Just keep
pedaling. Good girl. Now remember, it's all about balance and steering. Steer with your hands, steer with your body. Steer into the corners and you stay out of trouble. And the bell's your buddy, so go ahead and ding that. All right, you ready? Here we go. Pedal, honey, pedal. There you go, you're a bike rider.
Most parenting is hard to do in just 2 minutes. But 2 minutes twice a day making sure they brush is easier, and it could help save them from a lifetime of tooth pain.
Jimmy can't sing, and Tommy can't dance, so we're gonna put some ants in their pants.
Kids will spend 22 minutes watching us, the super duper party troopers, singing about ants in their pants.
Isn't that funny? Ants in their pants, they got ants in their pants, they got ants in their pants.
Brushing for 2 minutes now can save your child from severe tooth pain later. 2 minutes, twice a day. They have the time.
There's a shelter pet who wants to meet you. Meet one today. Visit theshelterpetproject.org. Adopt.
Welcome back to Special People, Special Issues. Before we get to the bulletin board, let's talk about some of the trends in the special needs industry or working with people with special needs.
Well, one of the biggest trends right now over the past 7 years is do more with less money. There's been
That's going to be kind of hard.
Oh, it's very hard. It's very hard. Lots of unfunded mandates, lots of oversight that there are no dollars to take care of, and asking voluntary agencies to develop infrastructures that don't necessarily existed before and aren't. You know, there's no direct dollars to offset that cost.
One of the main things that concerns me when I first heard about, a lot of things with Medicaid and people with special needs, they're creating titles, but and then it takes time and paperwork and so on.
Well, they're changing a couple of different things. They're changing a funding system, going from a legacy system to an APG codes. They're changing ICD-9 codes to ICD-10 codes, but that's like back office billing for Medicaid, which could drive everyone crazy. Hasn't changed in decades. It was alphanumerical. Now it's all revamped and rechanged.
But the biggest change that's occurring, and it sort of ties into what Tom is talking about with less funds, is that we are morphing from a fee-for-service model to managed care.
Right.
And that's the result of New York State having built a tremendous system to service folks with developmental disabilities.
Does Obamacare factor into this equation?
I'm not sure. Okay. But what factors into it is that it has become so expensive, or the system was becoming so expensive, that the state couldn't afford to do it. So now they're coming up with newer models. So for example, if you had a disabled child who was graduating from school, years ago you might have thought, okay, we'll find a program that we like and we'll have my kid go into one of their day programs and residences. Now there's going to be much more pressure put on you to try to keep your child at home. Send an aide in 2-3 times a week, but keep the person at home. Now, there are certain situations where that would probably work. There are certainly situations where this isn't going to work, because one of the things that parents liked about the old system is that when we offered residential and 5-day-per-week services, both spouses could conceivably work. Because you knew your child wasn't getting home to 4 or 4:30. In the new model, if you get 2 half-days worth of services, where's the individual going to go on those off days? So does that mean one of you has to stay home? Does that mean one of you has to hire your neighbor to watch your child? And it's a problem. The other trend that's there right now is New York State has absolutely decided that it is going to close its institutions. There aren't that many left, but there's a couple hundred. But these folks are people who are very, very disabled. And it's very challenging to take somebody like that and put them into an environment that can't necessarily deal with it.
Let's take the word disabled and not use it, because a lot of people with special needs are able. So when we talk about, a lot of words have changed. Special needs is better, and I say it differently, able. But when you say I know that.
So let me say, extremely behaviorally challenged.
Yeah.
And look, let's not kid ourselves. If somebody has severe acting out behavior, it is costly, not because of the behavior, but because what you want to change. And you need qualified staff, trained staff, patient staff, people who can understand what this behavior is about, and it is a very long process to modify that behavior. All of that's happening at the time when funds are shrinking. And that's going to be very, very challenging, because I don't know who can take these sorts of individuals into a home that historically has been a quiet, friendly, comfortable. The parents like it. It's a problem for parents.
So where do you see in the future? What do you see of the future of the trends and working with people with special needs. When you say that the budget is shrinking tremendously, where do you see that in, say, 20 years or 30 years from now?
Well, I think that what the state is hoping for is that there'll be some savings by providing services that are less costly. Mm-hmm. It's going to cost us less to keep your child at home. So there's going to be some savings with that. I think you're going to be a slowdown in terms of who actually comes into the system. Right now there's this new system called Front Door. The front door is very difficult to open. So if you can sort of artificially slow down the numbers of people who come into the service world, it's obviously going to save money. But I think in the end what you're going to see is a spectrum. You're going to see some of the traditional stuff. Some people are going to need an intermediate care facility simply because of the overall need that they exhibit. Mm-hmm. But you're going to see apartments, you're going to see individual apartments, dual apartments, all sorts of things that are perhaps less expensive. And you're going to also, I think, try to see the move to close down some of the large brick and mortar day programs that are there.
When we say brick and mortar, you mean...
It's a physical place.
Because, Willowbrook was similar to that. You saw people in rooms doing absolutely nothing, no programs, and they were just thrown, I hate saying to the dogs, but they were thrown in somewhere where people were getting force-fed to, and all kinds of diseases, and you know, and even though there are some institutions left, there are not as many because we're trying to change this.
There's only a few left, and I think in the state there's a couple hundred folks that are still in the developmental centers, but they do present some very difficult challenges, either medically, behaviorally.
I mean, New York State has grown tremendously over the past 35 years. We went from being one of the worst states providing services to a state that's become a leader in the industry in the country. And it's almost as if New York State's getting slapped right now for doing their job really well. You know, the state, in conjunction with voluntary agencies, have done a great job. But we just need to have a better partnership with government and better partnership with the private sector as we go forward.
Okay. Excuse me while we go to the bulletin board. For more information on Lifespire and their programs, you can contact them at Lifespire, 1 Whitehall Street, 9th floor, New York, New York, 10004. That's 1 Whitehall Street, 9th floor, New York, New York, 10004. Or you can visit them at www.lifespire.org. That's www.lifespire.org. 212-741-0100. 212-741-0100. For more information, go to info@lifespire.org. Again, thank you for joining me on this edition of Special People, Special Issues. I'm Lawrence Seiler. As always, see you next time.